MSW Media.
They Might Be Giants have been on the road for too long. And They Might Be Giants aren't even sorry. Not even sorry. And audiences like the shows too much. And now They Might Be Giants are playing their breakthrough album, Flood. All of it. And they still have time for other songs. They're fooling around. Who can stop They Might Be Giants and their liberal rock agenda? Who? No one. This ad was paid for with somebody else's money.
Rule of law is not just some lawyer's turn of phrase. It is the very foundation of our democracy. The essence of the rule of law is that like cases are treated alike. That there not be one rule for Democrats and another for Republicans, one rule for the powerful, another for the powerless, one rule for the rich and another for the poor, or different rules depending upon one's race or ethnicity. To serve as Attorney General at this critical time is a calling I am honored and eager to answer.
So now it's clean up on aisle 45 time. And for a long while yet, it is going to be clean up on aisle 45.
Hello and welcome to Clean Up on Aisle 45. This is episode 74. You're listening to this on Wednesday, June 15th. And joining me, as always, well, usually.
As usual.
is Andrew Torrez back from the COVID. Hello, sir.
Hey, how are you doing, Allison?
Oh, I'm, The news has doubled in the last week and a half or so it's been extremely busy over here on Team Beans, but it's good news mostly and very important stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am on the mend still, kind of wiped out from COVID, but I greatly appreciate the rest from last week. That was rough getting through, a sentence at a time. So
I bet.
But I'm fully vaxxed and doubly boosted, and it just it happened anyway. So there you go.
Yep, it's still a thing, and we're very glad we had everyone send out healing vibes. I know a lot of our patrons did, and I think we have some new patrons this week to give a shout out to. Yeah,
we do. We got 3 new patrons. They are Victoria Pentecost, thank you, Christopher Chasteen. And I became a patron of aisle 45 today so I could scold Andrew into resting. Well, thank you. Immediately after the conclusion of this recording, I promise you, I will do one more other thing and then I'll go rest. Okay. So
excellent. Good.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much.
So we're going to dive in today and we're going to talk about these hearings.
Woo.
But there's something else I wanted to talk about first. And I touched on this on Monday's Daily Beans, but saved getting into the weeds until today. The D.C. Bar has filed ethics charges against Rudy Giuliani.
Yay!
And since the story came out, we learned a lot about Rudy's role in the big lie during Monday's 1-6 committee hearing, including that an intoxicated Rudy spoke to a team of Trump and White House lawyers advising that Trump declare victory the night of the election before all the votes were counted. But first, let's dive into this ethics charge.
Okay. It's hard for me to pass up a lead like apparently intoxicated Rudy Giuliani, but I'm sure we're going to get there. Okay, so Rudy had already been suspended from practicing law by the New York bar, right? That was soon followed by a reciprocal suspension in D.C., pending the outcome of a sanctions investigation. And in the new filing from the D.C. Bar, Giuliani is also accused of violating Pennsylvania's rules of professional conduct. That is the trifecta, New York, D.C., Pennsylvania, because he, quote, brought a proceeding and asserted issues therein without a non-frivolous basis in law and fact for doing so, and, quote, engaged in conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice, which is putting it mildly.
Yeah. So explain the process here, because there's so many sanctions things going on with this guy and a lot of the folks on Trump's decided legal team. After we found out today, they split. There was a split, kind of like how there was a split on Ukraine policy back in the day. As CNN says, this is the first step in a process for Rudy to have his license permanently revoked. It's been a while since the investigations into his conduct began, and this seems like a multi-step process. It's not just like, and these aren't the Michigan referrals. It's not just like we refer you to the bar and the bar goes, okay, we've made a decision. There's a lot of steps here.
Yeah, that's right. And so let's break that down a little bit. In New York, just like what's happening here in D.C., the suspension from the practice of law is preemptive. Think about this as like being held without bail, right? The idea is we have not yet made a final determination on the merits, but we think you are potentially so dangerous that while we are investigating your conduct, we are going to suspend your license to practice law. I said at the time that it happened in New York that I have never seen this happen in my legal career, and now I've seen it happen twice to the same guy.
Yeah, and we talked about it too, right? Because we basically broke it down like, all right, they got the referral, they sat down, opened up all the stuff, and within 5 minutes went, holy shit.
Yeah, we can't allow this kind of courtroom.
Yeah, we got to suspend him now pending the outcome and then finish investigating. That's how bad it is.
Right. And so you are entitled to a quasi-judicial proceeding, right? It's not quite a trial, but you are entitled to a hearing. You can be represented by counsel before the bar disciplinary committee. And it's called different things in different states, but it's basically the same thing. And then you get an appeal as of right, usually to your state Supreme Court. Okay? So there will be evidence. You will have the opportunity to be heard. You have the opportunity to be represented by counsel. There will be a factual finding, and then that factual finding you get, assuming that it's bad, and I think we have every reason to believe that it will be bad for Rudy Giuliani, and then you get at least one appeal as of right, usually to your state's Supreme Court, your state's highest court, to say, okay, are we prepared to permanently disbar this person from the practice of law, right? Shocker that lawyers build in better protections for themselves than, we have for, I don't know, children found at the border. But there you go. And so the second half of your question, I want to make sure I don't lose the thread because it was a really, really good question, was whether this was connected to Michigan, and it isn't, right? This is about an investigation into the various Pennsylvania lawsuits, right? Not the Michigan sanctions. The election challenge in question was actually a lawsuit filed days after the 2020 election in a Pennsylvania federal court on behalf of the Trump campaign. And this is the one where at oral arguments, Giuliani claimed without evidence, we saw this in the 1-6 committee hearings today, that the best description of this situation is it's widespread, nationwide voter fraud, of which this is a part. This is where he advanced the claim that 8,000 dead people had voted in Philadelphia. And we heard testimony today that that it was 0. It was not even 8, let alone 8,000. So this was just Rudy Giuliani, possibly intoxicated, going into court and lying. And the bar frowns on that.
Yeah, and they brought up that intoxicated drunk part quite a few times. Intoxicated, inebriated. There was a lot going on there, and that was the night of the election. Now, the disciplinary filings in this case said that Giuliani, quote, had cited to the district court as a basis for his fraud allegations several sources that could not, as a categorical matter, prove that. The defendants in Pennsylvania in that case had, quote, committed or facilitated election fraud during the 2020 election. We can't prove that at all. That was what they had asserted. And Rudy also lacked evidence in his claims that in the case that barriers erected at Pennsylvania vote counting sites amounted to fraud. And Giuliani, quote, should have known the evidence he provided in this case to claim mass fraud relied upon false or faulty statistics and analysis.
Yeah, and they put evidence in scare quotes in that. That's never a good sign either. So of the 300 affidavits that Giuliani provided in that Pennsylvania case, the D.C. bar charges that they were A, unsupported, that they all fall into one of the or more of these categories. A, unsupported. That's a lot of them. B, unrelated to Trump voters. And it's shocking the number of affidavits that are just like, well, I saw a truck pull up and a guy had a trash bag and came into the building with a trash bag. So obviously those were Biden ballots. And you're like, what? Right. Anyway, C, involve conduct outside of the 7 defendant counties, right, that they were actually suing with respect to. And D, by their own terms, were isolated incidents that could not have affected the presidential election's results by offsetting the Biden majority of over 80,000 votes. And that is, look, like we know of one in Michigan. I don't know that there are any in Pennsylvania, but we know of one in Michigan. Turns out it was a Trump voter, but this happens once per election cycle. Like some dude will register to vote, and then will die, and his widow will go cast his vote on his behalf. Right? We'll say, Andrew's dying wish would have been that I came in and cast his vote for Donald Trump, so I did that. And is that technically election fraud? Sure. Is it uniformly pro Biden? Almost not, right? Almost all the cases we know about are actually Trump votes. And again, the most important part, it falls into this D category of you can throw a ton of spaghetti at the wall with respect to did this one dead guy vote? Did this one person vote out of their proper precinct? But it doesn't add up to 80,000. So
right, and there was one of the election experts who testified to that today in the hearing too. He's like, look, at the most, I think you might get 300, 200, of a change in vote, and it's not ever necessarily toward the person you want to go towards. There were several recounts that went in favor of Biden, but never near enough the amount that would be needed to overturn any of the key states.
Yeah, that was Ben Ginsburg who testified today. Very well-known Republican elections lawyer, was one of the folks at the head of the 2000 Bush litigation team, right? The successful Bush litigation team that generally known as a go-to guy in Republican politics when you need to file lawsuits. Who sort of surveyed the Kraken landscape, but is like, there's a reason they went 1-61, and their one victory was letting people sneeze on people, right? It was pretty powerful stuff. He's right. You might recall, one of the earliest episodes, it was episode 23 of Opening Arguments, was when we tackled the absolutely bogus, idiotic, ridiculous claimed recounts by Jill Stein of the Green Party that we're going to put, sweep Hillary Clinton into office. And so, if you still got an Uncle Frank listening to this show, which probably you don't, I said this exact same thing 6 years ago, right? I said, you do not get, tens of thousands of votes across 3 states by a recount. You get what Ben Ginsburg said. You get a couple of hundred votes. And that is, in fact, what happened in the only state in which the recount went forward, which was Wisconsin in 2016. The result of the recount was Trump gained 107 votes. So, you don't get 80,000. You don't get 30,000. You don't get 10,000 from recounts.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, Andrew, in this Barr investigation, what happens next?
Yeah, so this is the quasi-judicial proceeding. This is the hearing phase in which Giuliani gets to respond to the allegation. I don't know what his response is going to be. I mean, I didn't write this thing that's in black and white. I don't know. But so the charges get put before a hearing committee, which can consider extrinsic evidence as well as testimony in contested proceedings, and then, quote, prepares a report and recommendation with proposed findings of fact, conclusions of law, and a recommended sanction, which is then filed with the the DC Bar's Board of Professional Responsibility.
And earlier, one more question for you. Earlier, you mentioned that, normally if you want to contest this or appeal it, or if there's any authority, it's usually the state Supreme Court, but DC doesn't have one of those. So what happens there?
They do. Their state Supreme Court is called the DC Court of Appeals. And yeah, and I know it's weird. Maryland is the same way. It's just one of those, you go into New York, it's the same thing. Your state trial courts are called Supreme Courts. And it's just the highest court is called the Court of Appeals. So
Gotcha.
There you
And
go.
that's different from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals.
Correct.
Okay.
And it's super. When you practice in D.C., as I have for 25 years, it can get very confusing.
Yeah, they're weird with their attorney general and what they do, and
and
the U.S. attorney does the other stuff, and it's like, but that's a U.S. attorney. It's interesting.
And when you say you're in state court in D.C. and D.C. isn't a state, right? I mean, it's
what it is.
It's a lot of fun. So, but yeah, it goes up to highest court of D.C. And I think we can look forward to Rudy being disbarred. So I'm certainly I've got the Reuniti on ice for that one. So
and that's cool. He hasn't really practiced since like 2002.
Yeah.
And he's already suspended from practicing. But let's talk a minute about real quick about the hearing that we saw this morning. I know you and I are going to separately break it down in more detail on opening arguments and the beans, but it was important in that if I was going to sum up this hearing. It seems like there's two different sort of tracks, right? One is, the big lie to prove that Trump knew that he lost and that he was lying. But also this seemed like the grift, right? This was him going out and saying, raising money, fundraising, defrauding donors, I would say, on a known lie. But then also, Zoe Lofgren has told CNN spending that money on himself and his family, like personally enriching
Shocker.
himself.
Yeah.
And Bannon was pulled over on a yacht by the post office.
The post
cops
office, cops,
and arrested for that kind of a fundraising scheme. And we know Sidney Powell has been under investigation in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. Her PAC for fundraising off the big lie since back in September. That grand jury has been looking at her stuff with Flynn and that whole group, right? So, but the fact that Rudy, so that's sort of what today's hearings boiled down to for me, in that so that they could now introduce their next idea, right? They're like, all right, we got the big lie. We're putting all that stuff out there. We got our cases. We're losing our cases. Now in comes Eastman, right? With his thing. But I found it very, very interesting that there is seemingly evidence that the January 6th committee has that he defrauded, mail fraud, wire fraud, defrauded donors, broke a bunch of laws when he created that entity on November 9th, which was basically a slush fund for what he called the Election Defense Fund, and spent that money on everything but election defense.
Yeah, I agree that that's kind of the top line takeaway from watching today's hearings. And again, we're recording this on Monday. I think it illustrates the very diverse audiences that the January 6th committee is targeting, right? We got the report from Merrick Garland, who said, yeah, the DOJ is watching these hearings, right? So on the one hand, they are making the case to the Department of Justice in public. Hey, there are crimes going on. Put a pin in that one. On the other hand, right, they are trying to interest the American public, right, which includes, like, you and I and our listeners have been tracking this since the very beginning, right? But lots of Democrats, lots of independents, lots of, centristy Republicans have checked out. And you have to kind of loop them all back in. So from a legal perspective, this is what I think today's hearings established if I'm a potential prosecutor, right? And to me, if you ask me, what does a victory condition for the January 6th committee look like? One of them is an indictment of Donald Trump for 18 U.S.C. 2384 for seditious conspiracy, right?
But not from the committee.
Not from the committee, by the DOJ, right? Mm-hmm. Doesn't have to be a formal referral, can just be, as we know, as we heard today from Merrick Garland, Attorney General Merrick Garland, yeah, we're watching these hearings, right? And so what you have to do is you have to get a prosecutor over that hump that says, if I bring this case, I can bring this case and win. And I don't want to, because believe me, there's no shortage of prosecutors who would love to slap handcuffs on Donald Trump, right? But all of them are also thinking the same thing, which is, man, if I'm known as the person who got Trump an acquittal on these charges, then that will be the biggest possible disaster, right? He will walk around, even though it's not the case, he'll walk around going, see, a court declared me innocent, and even though that's not what courts do, that's what you have to get a prosecutor over. And we've talked about this a lot. 18 U.S.C. 2384 is an intent crime. You can offer as a defense the I was too stupid to crime defense, right? And if Donald Trump says, I believed firmly, fully, that I won by 20 billion votes, and Dominion, in league with the Illuminati and the reverse vampires, sent all the votes to Venezuela so that the ghost of Hugo Chavez could turn them into Joe Biden votes. No matter how fucking stupid that is, if he honestly believes that, it would be very, very hard to meet the exact terms of 2384 and show that somebody wanted to use force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States. You would say, yeah, he didn't think he wasn't trying to prevent or hinder the execution of any law of the United States. He was trying to correct a massive fraud, no matter how dumb that fraud was. And so today's efforts, I think, were meant to dispel. Look, you can't go all the way, right? We do not yet have the smoking gun of, an email from Donald Trump to John Eastman that says, yeah, I know it's all bullshit too, but this is all we got left, right? But today what we saw was, at minimum, willful ignorance. We saw Donald Trump surrounded. He had 50 different advisors, and 48 of them said, you, sir, have lost the election.
Right,
it's
including
over.
the
It's
DHS
done.
and the Attorney General, and actual people he appointed, by the way. And Joyce Vance brought up the idea of willful blindness. And that you put together a block of the things like you saw today that can defeat that idea that, because at some point you're being willfully blind.
Yeah, and I thought here the most effective witness we heard from, and we only saw televised clips from his interview with the January 6th committee, was Bill Stepien too, but Richard Donahue. Right. Who was at the DOJ. He is the guy who, in connection with the Eastman proceedings, said to Trump directly, if you install Jeff Clark as Attorney General, I will resign. 100 people will resign. You will be left with no one left at the DOJ. I'm not working for that asshole. Right. Like, that's Richard Donahue. And today we heard him describing what we've seen in his prior emails of he would go to Donald Trump and Trump would say, well, I saw that there was a big suitcase full. And he would say, all right, look, here you go. There's proof, no suitcase. And then what would happen? Well, then I saw that they were running through the votes 5 different times.
He would actually say, okay, fine. But what about the other things?
Right. Exactly right. And when you put all that together and you have somebody presenting an evidentiary case, and not just somebody, right? You've got Donahue, you've got Bill Barr, you've got your campaign manager, Bill Stepien.
CISA, DHS, Krebs, yeah.
Yeah. And then you say, I think I'm going to go with the drunk guy instead. Right. That is, again, is it a signed confession? It's not a signed confession, but juries make these kinds of calls all the time. And it's the kind of call where a jury could look at it and go, yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, he had enough information to understand that this was, in the words of Attorney General Bill Barr, utter bullshit. And he decided he was going to only listen to the people who told him what he wanted to hear. That's enough. Right. And that is enough to manifest an intent to first to obstruct an official proceeding and then to commit seditious conspiracy. So I thought that was very, very effective from a legal perspective. You could ask for more. Right. The piece we do not have yet is we do not have somebody testify. And again, hearsay is fine on this. Right. Like this is not a trial yet. And even at trial, it would be admissible if we have. And I gotta believe that we have Bill Barr saying, and then Trump told me X, right?
Yeah.
That's what we
Meadows
haven't heard
has
yet.
it too. So and maybe Cassidy Hutchinson that might be why she's the star witness. But and of course, very interestingly, when they brought up in the hearings last Thursday that Cheney said Scott Perry had called the White House to ask for a pardon. And then you mix that with the news that we got that Mark Meadows was incinerating documents in his office fireplace after a meeting with Scott Perry. So it's very interesting what Cassie Hutchinson is going to say. But I'm very interested in the Wednesday hearing, which is the hearing that's happening today as you're listening to this episode. And that is the one that's going to include the former DOJ officials, Donahue, Rosen, Engel. And they're going to be talking about the January 4th meeting, where what you said, hey, you're going to be presiding over a graveyard if you put that dickbag in charge of the DOJ. And I'm paraphrasing, but they did use the word graveyard.
Almost got it right. Yeah.
They did use the word graveyard. But dickbag is what they were thinking. I like to tell you what I think was in their mind at the time. And a lot of this is going to be, and I don't know if they're going to bring up fully the Eastman stuff or if that's for another day, but I want to talk, Andrew, a little bit about your expectations for that hearing, because that's the one I'm interested in, is the meaty Department of Justice stuff. But also the Eastman, you've been gone for a couple of weeks, and we've had a lot come out on the Eastman front, particularly a new crime fraud exception email, which isn't the right term, but whatever, where, and the way that I described this, Andrew, and tell me if you agree. When I was in the military, we had a saying, and that saying was, it's always better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And what seemed to happen here was that these two law groups branched off. One of them was like, we should go to court and try to see if the Electoral Count Act is unconstitutional. And that's Sidney Powell and Louis Gohmert and that whole group. And then there's another group.
You might call that
Eastman.
The idiot group. Keep going. Yeah.
But there's another idiot group of Eastman Rudy types who are like, no. We want to go to court on what the state's responsibilities are. We don't want to challenge the Electoral Count Act, because if we get an adverse ruling, adverse for them, not us. If we get an adverse ruling that says Pence has to just open and count the votes and can't throw out electors, and the Electoral Count Act is constitutional, our whole plan is fucked.
Yes.
Our whole illegal plan is fucked. So let's not go to the courts. Let's not do that, because it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. Let's just forge ahead with our bullshit thing. And that is the email. That sentiment is what was in the email, that part of the email at least, that has to be released to the January 6th committee under the crime fraud exception, which they have now. And
which they do now have. Yeah. So
along with 158 other documents, I believe.
Yep. So we learned a bunch of things in following the latest Eastman ruling, which again came right on the eve of the first January 6th committee hearings. And if you have been listening to us discuss the saga of John Eastman on the show, then you were less surprised by what you heard laid out in that kind of opening statement by Liz Cheney, because we were able to piece that together from the documents the January 6th committee had released. We learned interesting things that have still not yet been put together by the committee. So I want to share some of those with you right now. And so this is part of the court's ruling. So now remember, the court has looked at all of these documents in camera, right? They have released a whole bunch, right? 159 to the January 6th committee, but the court's seen everything and has, I think, a very good picture of exactly what happened. Here's what the judge said. This is Judge Carter of the U.S. District Court for the Central District of Columbia. So first they say, don't forget, in March, we found that John Eastman and Donald Trump more likely than not used their legal relationship to commit crimes. In particular, conspiracy to defraud the United States and obstruction of an official proceeding. 18 U.S.C. 371, 18 U.S.C. 1512 C2. Okay. Now, what about before January 4th? Eastman says, well, you only found that we were criming, up a couple of days before the 1/6. Like, the stuff we did in December, I'm sure was fine. Here's what the court says. The previously disclosed documents indicate that Dr. Eastman and President Trump's plan to disrupt the joint session on 1/6, that's what happened, was fully formed and actionable as early as December 7th, 2020. That's news. Ooh. Okay. Yeah. And that will be news to most people when that comes out at the January 6th committee hearing when you're listening to this show, right? Like this, I think you're going to see this case put together on Wednesday. We'll see if I'm right. On that day, Dr. Eastman forwarded a memo. This is the Cheeseboro memo, right? Explaining why January 6th was the hard deadline that was critical to the result of this election for the Trump campaign. A week later, on December 13th, President Trump's personal attorney, Pat Cipollone, received a more robust analysis of January 6th's significance, which was potentially, quote, the first time members of President Trump's team transformed a legal interpretation of the Electoral Count Act into a day-by-day plan of action. The current set of documents also confirm that the plan was established well before January 6th. In an email on December 22nd, an attorney with the Trump legal team referred to the January 6th strategy as a known plan to 8 other people. And again, keeping in mind that this ruling came out before the very first opening statement by the January 6th committee, that's a bombshell, right? Like this is about John Eastman's documents. And prior to reading that sentence, we knew of Eastman. We knew in connection with the reply brief, we heard about Ken Cheeseboro, but 8 other people, right, sitting there plotting. This is classic conspiracy stuff, right? Mm-hmm. This is not just like, where are we on the line from I'm asking my attorney, hey, if I stage a spontaneous demonstration outside Brett Kavanaugh's, right, like that kind of stuff, right, you could say, okay, well, did you go too far? Did it? But when you have 8 different people in a room.
Yeah, and you're referring to the January 6th strategy because as the 8 other people already know about it. That's what this sentence is saying in reference to the January 6th strategy as a known plan.
Yep.
Like, this isn't, hey, I'm going to introduce you to this January 6th strategy. This is, hey, remember that January 6th strategy that 9 of us have been talking about for a while? This is in reference to that.
Yep. And as a Christmas present, 2 days later, December 24th, this is your point. Eastman wrote in an email, because God, does he write the dumbest emails, that the worst case for the plan would be receiving a court decision that, and this is the words of Judge Carter, constrained Vice President Pence's authority to reject electors. Dr. Eastman and President Trump's plan to stop the count was not only established by early December, it was the ultimate goal that the legal team was working to protect from that point forward. That's a really crucial sentence, right? That is what you said earlier. No, we can't go to the court on this because we will lose, and then we will have an adverse decision, and then we can't even pretend anymore, right?
Yes, protect the plan. And part of me wonders if that's why Sidney Powell wasn't banished at the end of November from the legal team. Yeah, because she filed. She helped Gohmert file the lawsuit against Pence. They went that way, and they were like, no, we can't. And that's also, people were involved in that lawsuit that got emails from Ginny Thomas. I mean, it's a mess. This whole thing is a fucking mess. But it was very well parsed by Judge Carter, who's just excellent, just super succinct, excellent writer. I love the way that Judge Carter writes these rulings because it's very logical. It follows a path. It makes sense. So for the legal findings, it says here, for the reasons explained above, the court finds 440 documents are privileged. The court orders Dr. Eastman to disclose the other 159 documents to the committee by 2 p.m. Pacific on Wednesday, June 8th.
And keep in mind, this ruling came out Tuesday, June 7th. So, yeah.
Like you have half a day. So what were these docs? Let's break that down. I'll start here, Andrew. Yeah. Of those 159, 148 were non-privileged because they weren't seeking legitimate litigation strategy. They didn't fall into that work product document, right? Or doctrine, right? So, this was coordinating with idiots to meet at the Denny's parking lot and declare yourself an imaginary Trump elector. That's right. What those emails were about. And plenty more, 360, were coordinating doomed Kraken lawsuits. Right. And I'd love to see his advice, but that's actually legitimate attorney-client privilege. And I asked you about that. I was like, can you cite the Kraken bullshit lawsuits if you know the Kraken bullshit lawsuits were filed egregiously, frivolously, capriciously, Does that count? It does count. That's actually attorney-client privilege. J6 did not have a reason to know that. Neither did we. And the court didn't fault them for asking for it. They erred on the side of privilege. So stick a pin in that.
Yeah. And that's all exactly right. And look, my clients ask me all the time, hey, for example, I get this. I do once a week from my restaurant and bar owner clients that are like, hey, I want to sue this guy who posted a bad Yelp review. And I have to write back and go, if you were to sue them, you would, lose for 8 different reasons in court. This would be a very, very stupid lawsuit, right? So telling somebody your evaluation as a lawyer of their stupid lawsuit is legitimate attorney-client privilege. And the court went out of its way to say, all right, anything that seems like it came close to a real lawsuit, we're gonna give it to you, okay? But as you point out, 148 were the had to do with secretly declaring yourself an elector without going to the courts, which is the definition of not attorney-client work product, right? Because you're not going to court. And then there were 11 documents that were privileged, but the court released under the crime fraud exception. And we know the exact Bates numbers of this. We have some reason to think that folks connected to the committee listen to the show. So I'm going to announce what those numbers are. Would you look for them when you see them in public? The first one, and this is redacting most of a document number 51291. Okay. This is from a group of 5 different emails. And the court says, 4 of these 5 documents consider how filing certain election lawsuits might affect the January 6th plan. Now, we've talked about that. That is right on the line. That is, yeah, if you file and lose these, then, we can't even pretend anymore. In these emails, Dr. Eastman and his colleagues discuss how to frame their legal filings in light of what they considered a near zero chance of success in the D.C. courts. Attorneys reference January 6th not as the day to enact the plan, but as a deadline to bring timely and effective lawsuit. As the court noted in its prior order, pursuing legal recourse itself did not advance any crimes. Accordingly, those 4 emails, as close as they are to the line, and I would argue the other way, did not further the January 6th plan, so they got held back. But the 5th, December 22nd, 2020, an attorney, and this is, again, I'm quoting from the decision, goes beyond strategizing litigation outcomes. This email considers whether to bring a case that would decide the interpretation of the Electoral Count Act and potentially risk a court finding that the act binds Vice President Pence. Because the attorney concluded that a negative court ruling would, quote, tank the January 6th strategy, he encouraged the legal team to avoid the courts. This email cemented the direction of the January 6th plan. The Trump legal team chose not to seek recourse in court. Instead, they forged ahead with a political campaign to disrupt the electoral count. Lawyers are free not to bring cases, but they are not free to evade judicial review to overturn a democratic election. So that is document 51291. If you said, I only get to see one Eastman doc out of all this, that's the one I would want to see.
Yeah, 100%. And then real quick before you head out of here, I just want to mention those 3 meetings that were mentioned in this filing based on agendas in some of these emails. And some really interesting things in here. 5 of those documents include the agenda for a meeting on December 9th, 2020. Yep. That agenda included a section entitled Ground Game following the election, during which a sitting member of Congress discussed a plan to challenge the electors in the House of Representatives. And one document contained the agenda for a meeting the next week, December 16th. This meeting had a section called Ground Game, similarly. And in this segment, an elector for Trump analyzed the constitutional implications of the Electoral College meeting and what comes next. And the Select Committee had substantial interest in these 3 meetings. There was one other one.
Yeah, the other one was on December 8th, right? So December 8th, December 9th, December 16th, that led to 10 more documents that you've described, right? That have been produced to the 1-6 committee from John Eastman's files that are not protected because of the crime fraud exception, because they are evidence of collusion between John Eastman and the other folks on these emails and the president of conspiring to obstruct an official government proceeding. That's really significant. And I was really glad to hear the 1-6 committee specifically call out Judge Carter. As Zoe Lofgren did that, I think, a couple of times today. And to say, you know, as we said at the time, right, which was if a judge, I get that criminals are different, but like a judge is determined by a preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not, that Donald Trump and John Eastman committed crimes. If that's the case, it's trivially easy to get an indictment right now. Like that's higher than the standard that you need to convince a grand jury to indict. And you know, it's not the process. You know, you wouldn't just take the ruling and stick it in front of a grand jury. But you know,
no, I kind of have a little bit of a feeling that, you know, the J6 committee is going to hand over all their transcripts to Department of Justice in September. I don't think we're going to see any moves from the Department of Justice until they get those transcripts, and not because they need them. But because they're just going to add on to the mountains of evidence that they already probably have. And it's always better to have those depositions. I think one thing that the J6 committee did really well that sort of got taken off the plate of the Department of Justice was to see who was going to be an asshole and who was going to cooperate. They didn't have to go through any of that shit and all the court and all the bullshit. You know, they got to see who was going to be like, fuck you, I'm not coming in and talking, and who was going to come in and talk. And then they're going to also get those talks. I think that's great.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's also a good point that, you know, when Trump was in power, you could identify, right? Bill Barr cut off the Mueller report at its knees by 3 weeks beforehand, lying about it, omitting the word "not" from his quote summary. It got Robert Mueller mad enough to write a series of letters, but not mad enough to come out and say, the Attorney General is lying about what my report says. And that absolutely, I mean, you know, we saw what happened with respect to that. Mm-hmm. They identified the thing that couldn't happen, and then they got everybody to line up in lockstep against it. And here we have almost the exact opposite, right? We have no messaging in advance. And we have, you know, did Mark Meadows start to cooperate and then turn asshole? Yeah, sure, right? But like, it doesn't matter. You have Bill Barr ranting on camera for, oh gosh, like I would, you know, if you could have, you know, any film in history, I would love to have the rest of Bill Barr's testimony there. So, so. Important thing, the last part is, of those 148 non-privileged docs, there's lots of good stuff in there too, and we can talk about that in a future episode. Keep your eyes peeled. I want to talk about it in a future episode, because I think a lot of it's going to come out in the hearings between now and next week's episode. So we're going to do that. We're going to see what comes out. If anything's missing, we will fill in the gaps from what we know from the Eastman emails on the next Cleanup on Aisle 45. Andrew, I am so glad you're feeling better, my friend. Continue. I know that you need to get some rest right now. We're all sending you healing vibes. And any final thoughts before we get out of here today? This has been everything that I could have hoped for, and love watching the January 6th committee do its job.
Yes, all the great minds that I've talked to in the past week or so are like, this is good. I think what I said is that these hearings are fit for history. Yeah. And I think that history will bear them out. They're kind of like creeper weed in that way. You know, like, remember when you get like some creep nugs and you like smoke it and then you're fine until like maybe 2 hours later it starts to set in? That's what these hearings are like. Like, as you get further away from the hearing, it starts to sink in everything that came out. I think that's going to be happening for decades. I really do.
I think you're right. I'm going to have to defer to you on the creeper weed analogy, but I will sign on. No, precious little cinnamon bun, but yeah.
I just heard from my friends. All right. We'll talk to you all next week. I've been Allison Gill. I've been AG.
I'm Andrew Torrez, and this is Cleanup on Aisle 45.
Cleanup on Aisle 45 is written, researched, and produced by Allison Gill and Andrew Torrez, with editing by Molly Hockey. Our art and logo design are by Joelle Reeder and Moxie Design Studios, and our music is composed and performed by Adam Orr. Cleanup on Aisle 45 is a proud member of the MSW Media Network, a collection of creator-owned podcasts dedicated to news, politics, and justice. For more information, visit mswmedia.com.
Season 4 of How We Win is here.
For the past 4 years, we've been making history in critical elections all over the country. And last year, we made history again by expanding our majority in the Senate, beating election-denying Republicans in crucial state house races, and fighting back a non-existent red wave.
But the MAGA Republicans who plotted and pardoned the attempted overthrow of our government now control the House, thanks to gerrymandered maps and repressive anti-voter laws. And the chaotic spectacle we've already seen shows us just how far they will go to seize power, dismantle our government, and take away our freedoms.
So, the official podcast of The Persistence is back with Season 4. There's so much more important work ahead of us to fight for equity, justice, and our very democracy itself. We'll take you behind the lines and inside the rooms where it happens with strategy and inspiration from progressive changemakers all over the country.
And we'll dig deep into the weekly news that matters most and what you can do about it with messaging and communications expert, co-founder of Way to Win, and our new co-host, Jennifer Fernandez-Ancona.
So join Steve and I every Wednesday for your weekly dose of inspiration, action, and hope.
I'm Steve Pearson.
And I'm Jennifer Fernandez-Ancona.
And this is How We Win.